Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Sins of Jack Saul, 2nd edition. The True Story of Dublin Jack and the Cleveland Street Scandal, by Glenn Chandler. Narrated by Roger Clark. Note on the 2nd edition. The 2nd edition of this book has afforded me the opportunity to add much more material on the Dublin scandals, the clients of 19 Cleveland Street, and Jack's later life. I have also taken the opportunity to make one or two corrections. Since publication, The Sins of Jack Saul, the musical, based on this book, was performed at the Above the Stag Theatre in London, the 11th of May to the 12th of June, 2016. During the run, an audience member tweeted that Jack Saul was the patron saint of rent boys the world over. It is a sentiment Jack could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. Forward. I first encountered Jack Saul when I was writing a stage show called Cleveland Street, the musical. It was a satirical romp based on the notorious homosexual scandal which centred on a male brothel in Victorian London, one that rocked the British establishment in 1889. I produced it at the Above the Stag Theatre, London's only LGBT space, then in Victoria, but now carrying on its sterling work at new premises in Vauxhall, south of the river. All theatre production is a risk, financially and artistically, but thankfully the show was a sellout. Audiences were keen to see how we would present a story of sodomy and sex for sale in Victorian backstreets with songs, and, yes, an upbeat and happy ending. In fact, the musical format complemented the true story very well indeed, allowing us to escape from the grim reality of the subject, which, had we gone down that route, would have necessitated a very serious and worthy drama, and concentrate instead on what was essentially a story of conspiracy and hypocrisy, truly appalling Victorian values, and larger-than-life colourful characters. The clients of the brothel at 19 Cleveland Street included members of Parliament and the House of Lords, wealthy bankers, high-ranking figures in the military, and very possibly the grandson of Queen Victoria and heir presumptive to the throne, Prince Albert Victor Edward, Duke of Clarence. Prince Eddie's role was never proven, but the merest hint of the involvement of the son of the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne elevated the affair into the major sex scandal of Victoria's reign. The other factor, which made the brothel infamous, was that telegraph messenger boys from the General Post Office were recruited to sell their bodies to supplement their wages. One of the lads was only 15. The house was managed by Charles Hammond, who had been a male whore, or professional sodomite himself, and his French wife Caroline. They appear to have enjoyed a good few years running it with impunity. John Saul, otherwise known as Jack Saul or Dublin Jack, lived and worked there for a time and was intimately associated with the Hammonds. He was a rent boy, or renter as they were known then, a little past his sell-by date, but nevertheless still actively pursuing clients around Piccadilly and the Haymarket, even as the police gathered evidence to be used in prosecutions. Jack Saul, we shall call him that from now on, was the most notorious male prostitute in Victorian London. He is, for that and many other reasons, the most intriguing character of the whole affair. He has long been an enigma. Students of gay history, and particularly that of the late 19th century, have speculated on his identity. Why should he be so fascinating? Because if we are to believe everything that is written, and that which he wrote himself, he was involved in not just one, but 3 major gay scandals in the space of 2 decades without anyone knowing where he came from, what happened to him afterwards, or if indeed John or Jack Saul was his real name. Jack intrigues for another reason. He is the central character in a controversial and autobiographical work of Victorian pornography called The Sins of the Cities of the Plain. This was clandestinely and anonymously published in 1881, years before his involvement with the Cleveland Street brothel, giving weight to the theory that the name was originally a pseudonym. For who on earth would put their real name to a book which provides, in highly explicit detail, a long and relentless list of their sexual acts, which, if proven, could earn the author a long period of imprisonment? Not only did Jack Saul contribute his name, but also the street where he lived, so that anyone might look for him. Jack was the first person in literature, if one dares to call it that, to give a personal account of meeting Ernest Bolton and Frederick William Park, the two transvestites, otherwise known as Fanny and Stella, who shocked Victorian society 11 years earlier by going around the West End of London dressed as women, picking up men for sex, and having a high old time with a succession of male lovers. That case was the first in a 25-year period of Victoria's reign, which culminated in the trial of Oscar Wilde and his imprisonment in Reading Jail. Between them, in the course of that quarter-century, lay the so-called Dublin felonies, during which a number of men had their lives laid bare and ruined, and the grandfather of them all, the Cleveland Street affair. Had Jack Saul been connected only with the writing of Sins and his recollections of Bolton and Park, his name would be forgotten today, consigned to an ancient book locked away in the Forbidden Books section of the British Library. But he wasn't. Like a tarnished penny, he rolls out from between its pages and through the next 2 decades, turning up in Dublin to give evidence against a soldier with whom he had enjoyed a sexual relationship, and finally at the Old Bailey, to stand up in court, at great risk to himself, on behalf of a man he had never met. In one of the 3 trials that followed on from the discovery of Charles Hammond's boy brothel. The 2 previous books on Cleveland Street were both written in 1976, when the files on the case were finally opened to researchers after a period of 85 years. There is a sense that the authors were competing with each other to get them on the bookshelves. The Cleveland Street Scandal by H. Montgomery Hyde largely concentrates on the legal maneuvering in high places to bring an appalling business concerning brothels, buggery, and boys to a swift conclusion. It was diligently researched, and Montgomery Hyde was well placed, being gay himself and a Belfast-born barrister. The Cleveland Street Affair by Colin Simpson, Lewis Chester, and David Leitch is the more rollicking of the 2, and more fun, devoting a whole chapter to Jack Saul's colourful world of dormitory shenanigans in boarding schools and goings-on in the boudoirs of the aristocracy. Both books take as their starting point the moment when the brothel at 19 Cleveland Street is discovered, at which point the more low-life participants are soon dispatched so the authors can concentrate on the machinations of government to keep Prince Eddie out of the scandal. In a way, Prince Eddie has hijacked the Cleveland Street story. The very suggestion that the Queen's grandson might have visited the house incognito at night, while royal aides waited nervously outside in a hansom cab with a driver paid handsomely to keep his eyes out front and his mouth shut, is alluring to the conspiracy theorist in us. His spectre hangs over the house. It was the reason for the whole business being hushed up so quickly. Neither of the books mentioned uncovers the real Jack Saul. They get his age wrong, hardly surprising, as Jack himself laid the groundwork for the confusion, as we shall see, and coldly dispense with him at the end. More recently, Jack the Ripper internet forums have buzzed with speculation about him, for 2 reasons. Inspector Aberline, the policeman in charge of the Ripper hunt, was the following year put in charge of the Cleveland Street case, and there are still those convinced that Prince Eddie was behind the Ripper murders, joining the 2 cases at the historical hip. No one has yet suggested that Jack Saul was Jack the Ripper, but in the inexhaustible search for suspects and the ever-expanding canon of many totally ridiculous Jack the Ripper books, it is bound to happen one day. The best and most serious attempt so far to pin down Jack Saul has come from Justin O'Hearn, a Victorianist doctoral student who took a PhD in English at the University of British Columbia. Justin, in his first year, decided to specialize in Victorian literature, and as a subspecialty, clandestine publications like The Sins of the Cities of the Plain. To put it in Justin's own words, he likes to study naughty books. In his brilliant and incisive essay on Jack, Justin explored three personas. In Saul the author, he analyzes the sins of the cities of the plain. In Saul, the professional sodomite, he admits that little is known about Jack Saul except that he was supposedly a male prostitute in London originally from Ireland. In the third, Justin maintains that we can point to another Jack, Saul the individual, as an early gay rights activist. It is a fascinating proposition. Finally, however, Justin admits the complications of pinning him down, as has everyone up to this moment. I would point to yet another Jack, Saul the survivor. He worked the streets, putting himself at risk every day. He finally got off the streets and eventually tried to do something with his life. He had a family, a mother he loved and who loved him. He had brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. He was once a boy who stood on the brink of manhood and decided, for better or for worse, which way he should go. Jack's story is also the story of Charles Hammond, with whose life his became inextricably intertwined, the wily, unscrupulous, money-grabbing pimp and brothel owner, about whom it is impossible to say anything very kind, except perhaps that he too, like Jack, had a family he loved and was a survivor. Many monstrous men love their families. Had he lived today, Hammond would have been branded a paedophile. His crimes, however, were of their time, and while it is no excuse to say that in Victorian London child prostitution was rife, he was certainly not the most guilty of the guilty, which is more than can be said for the titled upper classes and landed gentry who used his services. Nothing much, it seems, changes. At the time of writing, the British media is obsessed with the subject of VIP sexual abuse of minors. Whether or not it is proven to be as widespread as they suggest, the story of Jack Saul and the Cleveland Street scandal seems suddenly very prescient. It is possible to trace most of the protagonists of the Cleveland Street affair. The boy telegraph messengers, with one or two exceptions, married and raised families. The aristocratic clients of the house are all in Who's Who, but Jack Saul has never been found. Yet Jack did leave a few footprints in the sand, which enable one to discover where he came from and, just as importantly, what happened to him. My discovery of one of those footprints was a combination of luck and research, as are so many genealogical eureka moments. It was fortunate that householders in the 1901 Irish census were required to sign their form, unlike in England where it wasn't required until 1911. I was perusing one such Irish census entry online, courtesy of the National Archives of Ireland, when a signature struck me as faintly familiar. My mind raced back 5 years to when I was writing Cleveland Street, the musical. Then, for research purposes, I had photocopied a police statement signed by Jack from our own National Archives and subsequently filed it away. I still had it. I dug it out and looked at Jack's signature. The signatures on the police statement and the much later householder census form were unmistakably those of the same person. It would be no exaggeration to say that it took my breath away. From that moment on, everything else fell into place, and a trail that took me back and forth to Ireland began. Jack Saul was no pseudonym. He was as real as Dublin potatoes, and Dublin is the city where we have to go to find him. Chapter 1. The Road to Harold's Cross. It was a short journey, but the last one the man would ever make in life. And it would pass almost every place south of the River Liffey that had meant something to him as he had grown up. The driver of the hackney cab, James Saul, 30 years old and newly married, would not care for some of the places known to his passenger, or wish to remember what had happened there. As for London, that was out of sight and out of his mind. His brother, lying in the back of the cab, knowing he was going to die, had lived the kind of life neither of his cab-driving siblings wanted to know anything about, and he was taking the full story of it to his grave. The journey began at South Frederick Street, a road of decaying Georgian tenements, where James had looked after his brother for as long as he was able. They turned right into Molesworth Street, close to the Masonic Temple, and down past the end of South Ann Street where they had grown up together. Their old house, up a narrow passageway just out of sight, held the memories of boyhood along with grinding poverty. It was where they once played, barefooted and dirty-kneed, with scores of other neighbourhood children. There were still children there now. There were always children. The streets of Dublin teemed with them, half-starved urchins selling wares to raise a few coins to take back to their families. At least James had a job, unlike the fathers of some of them, and he would raise his family as best he could. His brother had raised himself out of dire poverty too. It had brought money into the family. It had also brought shame, in not so equal measure. They turned along the side of St. Stephen's Green and down the more gentrified Harcourt Street, where his brother had worked for a while at a job that was respectable, but which he had left under a cloud of his own making. The corner house was still there, tall and solidly Georgian, still preserving an air of gentility, though now looking rather shabby. As he always did here, James took care with the horse. The hooves tended to slide on the paving stones between the tram lines, which the Tramways Company once spread with sand in the days when they were horse-pulled. Since electrical traction had been introduced, the company had neglected the roads. The Jarvies, who drove the horse-drawn cabs, were the casualties of that neglect. There had been numerous court cases involving injuries to horse and driver, but the Dublin roads remained in a dreadful condition. They headed south towards the Grand Canal, which ultimately connected Dublin with the River Shannon to the west. His brother, sick and feverish in the back, looked right before they crossed the canal, and saw for one last time the Portobello district, with its barracks, soldiers, and prostitutes that he had known so well. One of the many areas of Dublin which had seared itself into his consciousness as a boy growing up in the city. He had left all that behind a long time ago, and he was leaving it behind again. Across the canal, James saw their destination ahead, the hospice at Harold's Cross, a 2-story high building fronted with granite with limestone framing the windows and front porch. On the other side of the water was another institution, one that his passenger remembered well, also a granite building, but one with an unwelcoming air. Within the Griffith Barracks was the Richmond Bridewell, a prison where his brother had spent a few uncomfortable nights as a young man contemplating his future. He would spend many more nights now contemplating his past, hopefully not so uncomfortable, though his health or lack of it would ultimately decide that. The district of Harold's Cross was a much healthier neighbourhood than the one they had just left. Here, at Our Lady's Hospice, he would be cared for until the end. James left his brother to the love and mercy of the Religious Sisters of Charity and returned to the city, to his job. He would visit, but he knew that there was little more that he could do. It was 1904. An era had ended 3 years earlier with the death of Queen Victoria. Lord Salisbury, 4 times Prime Minister, across whose desk had once passed the name of the man, now in the care of the sisters, but who had as quickly forgotten it as new crises absorbed him, had only recently died. The dream of Irish Home Rule seemed as far away as ever, while the British Empire spanned a fifth of the globe, and Edwardian Britain basked in the hope and sunshine of a fresh millennium. At Harold's Cross, Jack Saul had plenty of time now to look back on a life that had been described in court as one of infamy. He knew that in the Great Reckoning, he had been a Catholic all his life, if not a good one, he hadn't been completely bad, even if his family considered him to be so. He had at least done one good thing, had stood up to the establishment and to the foreign occupier of his country of Ireland, no less, in order to prevent an injustice. Was one good thing enough to balance the books? As he lay in his bed in the ward, lightweight cotton dimity curtains hanging by the side of him and moving gently in the soft breeze from an open window, Jack Saul reflected that it wasn't bad for a boy from the Dublin slums who had been born without any hope in sight. Chapter 2. The Liberties. Dublin in the middle of the 19th century was a city blighted with slums, decaying Georgian tenements, most of which were unfit for human habitation. Whole families lived in wretched, vermin-infested single rooms where the only bedding was a filthy straw mattress. Poverty was crippling. It was by no means unusual for 100 people to share one tap and primitive outside toilet. Human excreta and horse dung lay about backyards. Infant mortality was shockingly high, and frail wraiths of children, filthy and malnourished, played in streets that were no better than open sewers. The photographs of the time tell only part of the story. Grim monochrome buildings frame groups of ill-clad youngsters and bare feet with sunken eyes, skinny limbs, and haunted expressions. The odd child whose parents can afford to buy him boots stands out with a look of smugness on his grimy face. Young girls stare at the camera, as old and as worn out as their mothers, and wearing the same clothes. Boys in cloth caps and threadbare shirts look like their fathers. It appears to be a different world entirely, Dickensian, awful, beyond salvation. The sun never seems to shine. Yet the tenements, putrid alleys and courts have a strange romance about them. Their neat rectangular Georgian frontages, redolent of a more prosperous age, now home to the people of the abyss. Transpose the children to any British city at the time and they would look the same. But Dublin wasn't like any other British city. It didn't have the burgeoning major industrial base of Manchester or Glasgow or Birmingham. It didn't have the wealth or growth of London. Those cities had slums too, but they had populations drawn there because of the opportunities to work. Dublin was different. It seemed fated to sit across the water from mainland Britain, neglected and forgotten, a city that wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. It had not always been so. The previous century, the once fine mansions had housed a large civil and administrative population. Ireland had its own governing body, albeit one in thrall to London, but the ruling Irish Protestants had demonstrated a woeful incapacity to keep law and order and rebellion at bay. The consequent Act of Union in 1801 and the abolition of the Irish Parliament by its English neighbour had an unintended consequence. No longer needed to run the affairs of the country, most of the middle-class population in the already hopelessly overcrowded city centre sold their stately residences and moved to the more pleasant suburbs, leaving their homes to stand empty and rot. Those were bought up by rapacious and profiteering landlords, who divided and subdivided them and crammed their tenants into increasingly smaller spaces. Some of the most dilapidated slums were to be found south of the River Liffey, in the Liberties, so called because historically the area lay outside the original city walls, which stood around the hill of Christ Church. At its heart today is the famous Guinness Brewery. A number of streets, including Kevin Street, the Coombe, Francis Street, Cork Street and Chamber Street, all in the vicinity of St. Patrick's Cathedral, had long been regarded as the worst in the district. It was here, just off Kevin Street, in a block of houses called Ferns Court, that Jack Saul was born, in the parish of St. Nicholas, on the 29th of October, 1857, and baptized shortly afterwards at home, which was the common practice, as was the recording of both his and his father's name in Latin by the parish priest. He was christened Johannes John Saul, son of Guilhelmus, William, Saul, and Eliza Revington. He was to be the eldest son of 8 children, preceded only by a sister, Maria, born in 1853. Both she and Jack were born out of wedlock, their parents not marrying until 6 months after Jack's birth. If Ferns Court possessed any claim to fame prior to Jack Saul's birth, it was a quarter of a century earlier, when Aaron Botts, a Chelsea pensioner, said to be 106 years old, died there. 8 years before his death, it was reported, he was summoned for paternity of a child. His longevity and virility probably had little to do with the health of the place in which he lived. The name is deceptive. In Dublin, any address at that time with the word court in it generally indicated a group of broken-down houses, 2 or 3 stories high, built on land round the back of other houses and accessed by a narrow passageway. The only things that grew large in the vicinity of Ferns Court, it was sometimes referred to as Fearon's Court, were not ferns, but the rats that were reputed to come out at night and feed on the milk of lactating mothers as they slept. At the time Jack was born, Ferns Court and the neighbouring tenements of Kevin Street teemed with large families, as did the whole of Dublin. It was the great famine of the 1840s that had brought thousands, including his father, William Saul, his grandfather, also called William, and his grandmother, Maria, along with at least 4 of their grown-up children and aunts and uncles, from the clean air of the countryside to the horror of the Dublin slums, in search of food and work. Saul is not a common name in Ireland. It is of Norman origin, and their ancestors settled originally in the south, around Tipperary and Waterford. By the time Jack's father was born, they were centred mainly about Rathdrum in County Wicklow and Drumcondra in County Meath. His father, uncles and grandparents in actual fact came from the area around Killisky in County Wicklow, just to the north of Rathdrum, a large parish which extended from near the coast up onto the slopes of the Wicklow Mountains. Lewis's Topographical Dictionary of Ireland described it as in the highest state of cultivation, and the system of agriculture is generally improved. There is neither bog nor wasteland, except some tracts of mountain, which may be easily reclaimed. The surrounding country is remarkable for the boldness and impressive magnificence of its features, and within the limits of the parish are several gentlemen's seats. This was written 8 years before the famine, and might give the impression that the potato blight did not touch that part of County Wicklow. But it did, though not quite so severely as the west and the south of Ireland. Its proximity to Dublin, and the fact that there was more arable and cultivated land, meant that it escaped the worst. But at the height of the hunger, the workhouses were still full. Much of the population was starving, and government relief works were inundated with men desperate to earn enough to feed their families. The Sauls, landless labourers or peasant farmers of probably only a few acres at most, lived through the failures of the potato crop year after year. But in 1847, when the disease devastated the crop for a 3rd year running, like thousands of other families, they sought a way out. And so the slow march north began, from a countryside in crisis to a city unable to cope. Many, such as Jack's father and siblings, were born and baptized into the established Church of Ireland at the ironically named Nuns' Cross Church on the edge of Ashford, but had left their Protestant roots behind and married as Catholics, rearing Catholic children. This was not uncommon in the age after Catholic emancipation. Jack.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?